The villagers always watched Martha from a distance. Not because she was dangerous. Not because she caused trouble. But because she seemed to live according to rules that nobody else understood. At 43, Martha was larger than most women in the valley. Years of hard work and long winters had given her a heavy frame, broad shoulders, and strong arms. Her cheeks were round, her hands calloused, and her clothes were almost always stained with soil, dust, or stone powder. People often judged her before speaking to her. They saw her size before they saw her determination. They saw her solitude before they saw her courage. And because she lived alone, most of them never bothered to learn anything more. 6 years earlier, Martha had buried her husband, Daniel. The memory still visited her on quiet evenings. Daniel had been a patient man who loved the mountains. He could spend hours sitting on the porch watching clouds crawl over distant peaks. Together they had dreamed of repairing the old property they bought on the hillside. But dreams are fragile things. A sudden illness had taken him before they could build the life they imagined. For months after his death, the little cabin felt empty. The silence became almost unbearable. There were mornings when Martha woke up expecting to hear Daniel splitting wood outside. There were evenings when she accidentally set 2 plates on the table before remembering there was only one person left to eat. The loneliness settled over her like winter snow. Many people expected her to sell the property. Others assumed she would move into the village where neighbors could keep an eye on her. Instead, she stayed. Not because it was easy. Because leaving would have felt like abandoning the last piece of the life she and Daniel had built together. The mountains became her companions. The forests became her comfort. And the work became her purpose. The hillside where her cabin stood was beautiful but unforgiving. Every spring, melting snow loosened rocks above her property. Heavy rains carved channels through the soil. Small landslides occasionally swept down the slope. Each year, the danger seemed to grow. One afternoon Martha stood outside after a storm and watched a stream of mud wash across her garden. She stared at the damage for a long time. Most people would have called for help. Some would have hired workers. Others might have simply accepted the situation. Martha made a different decision. She would build stone retaining walls. Not one wall. Several. Walls strong enough to protect the hillside. Walls strong enough to hold back the mountain itself. The idea sounded impossible. Especially for a woman working alone. Especially for a woman whom people already considered physically incapable. When she mentioned the plan in the village store, several men exchanged amused looks. One even laughed. "Those walls take teams of workers." Another shook his head. "That's a young man's job." Martha said nothing. She simply paid for her supplies and left. She had learned long ago that arguing with doubters rarely changed anything. Results did. The next morning she began. The first stone nearly defeated her. It was larger than she expected and awkward to move. She struggled for almost an hour before finally rolling it into position. Her back ached. Her hands blistered. Her muscles screamed in protest. But when the stone settled into place, something inside her changed. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of progress. A sense of purpose. A sense that she was building something instead of merely surviving. So she returned the next day. And the day after that. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Every morning Martha woke before sunrise. She drank coffee while watching mist drift through the valley. Then she went to work. She gathered stones from nearby fields. She learned which rocks fit together naturally. She studied old photographs of mountain walls built by farmers decades earlier. She watched how experienced masons stacked stone without mortar. Slowly, patiently, she taught herself. Mistakes happened constantly. Sections collapsed. Heavy rains washed away unfinished work. Some days she accomplished almost nothing. Yet she kept going. One stone. Then another. Then another. By the end of the first year, a short wall curved along the lower edge of her property. By the end of the second year, it stretched farther across the hillside. People stopped laughing quite as much. Some still doubted her. But others began noticing something remarkable. The walls were beautiful. They followed the natural contours of the land. They looked as though they had always belonged there. One autumn afternoon, while Martha worked on a new section, she noticed movement high on the ridge above her. A man stood watching. Even from a distance she recognized him. Ethan. Most people in the valley knew who he was. Few actually knew him. He lived alone in a cabin deep in the mountains after losing his wife several years earlier. He rarely attended community gatherings. Rarely visited town. Rarely spoke more than necessary. Rumors surrounded him because silence always invites speculation. Some said he preferred animals to people. Others claimed grief had turned him into a recluse. Whatever the truth was, Ethan spent most of his time alone. Martha watched him for a moment before returning to work. The next day he appeared again. And the day after that. Sometimes he stood quietly on the ridge. Sometimes he walked nearby trails. But he always seemed to notice the growing walls. One crisp morning, Martha struggled with a particularly large stone. The rock refused to cooperate. She pushed. Pulled. Rolled it a few inches. Then stopped to catch her breath. Suddenly another pair of hands grabbed the opposite side. She looked up. Ethan. Neither spoke immediately. Together they maneuvered the stone into position. The task that would have taken Martha an hour took only minutes. When the rock settled perfectly into place, Ethan stepped back. Martha brushed dirt from her hands. Thank you. His expression remained calm. No problem. That might have been the end of it. But something unexpected happened. The following day Ethan returned. This time he helped lift several stones. The next day he came back again. And again. Neither asked many questions. Neither shared dramatic stories. Both carried enough grief to understand that some wounds don't need explanations. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. As the weeks passed, small conversations began appearing naturally. They talked about weather. Wildlife. Trees. Mountain trails. Simple things. Yet Martha found herself looking forward to those conversations. For years she had carried every burden alone. Now another person stood beside her. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to. One evening the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the valley gold. Martha and Ethan stood beside the newest section of wall. The structure stretched farther than either of them realized. Solid. Strong. Enduring. Ethan ran a hand across the stone surface. Then he looked at Martha. There was admiration in his eyes. Not pity. Not judgment. Admiration. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, Ethan felt something awakening inside him. As he gazed at the woman who had spent years building walls stone by stone, he wasn't merely seeing what she had created. He was seeing resilience. Strength. Patience. A future. And for the first time since losing his wife, the thought didn't frighten him. Winter arrived earlier than usual that year. The first snowfall came in late October, covering the mountains in white long before the valley was ready. By November, icy winds swept through the forests almost every day. Most people stayed indoors whenever possible. But Martha and Ethan continued working. The stone walls had become more than a project. They had become part of their daily lives. Each morning, they met near the hillside and spent hours carrying rocks, adjusting foundations, and strengthening older sections. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they worked in complete silence. Neither felt the need to fill every moment with words. There was comfort simply knowing someone else was there. For Martha, that feeling was unfamiliar. For years she had faced every challenge alone. Every broken fence. Every leaking roof. Every difficult decision. There had been nobody to share the burden. Nobody to ask for advice. Nobody to celebrate small victories. Now, when a section of wall was completed, Ethan was there to admire it. When a heavy stone refused to cooperate, he was there to help move it. When the evenings grew cold, there was someone waiting beside the fire with a cup of coffee and a quiet smile. The friendship grew naturally. Neither tried to force it. Neither rushed anything. They simply allowed trust to form one day at a time. One afternoon, snowflakes drifted gently through the air while they rested beside the wall. The valley below looked peaceful beneath a blanket of white. For several minutes neither spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. "My wife loved winter." Martha turned toward him. It was the first time he had mentioned her. Ethan stared toward the mountains. She said snow made everything look clean. Like the world was getting another chance. His voice carried sadness. But not the sharp pain Martha expected. Instead, it sounded like someone remembering a beautiful song. "I still miss Daniel every day," Martha admitted softly. Ethan nodded. "So do I." There was no need to explain further. Both understood. Grief never completely disappears. It simply changes shape over time. The conversation ended there. Yet something important happened that day. A door opened. The walls around their hearts became a little smaller. December arrived with powerful storms. Meteorologists warned that the mountains could experience one of the harshest winters in years. The villagers prepared as best they could. Firewood was stacked. Animals were sheltered. Emergency supplies were gathered. Then came the storm. It arrived during the night. The wind sounded like a living creature roaring through the mountains. Snow fell so heavily that visibility disappeared entirely. Trees bent under the force of the gale. Branches snapped. Entire sections of hillside shifted beneath the weight of water and ice. Inside her cabin, Martha barely slept. The house trembled with every gust. Hours passed. Then more hours. The storm seemed endless. At dawn, the wind finally weakened. Silence slowly returned. Martha stepped outside. The world looked completely different. Snow covered everything. Broken branches littered the ground. Fresh scars marked sections of the mountain where earth had given way. Her heart began racing. The hillside above her property had always been vulnerable. If a landslide had occurred during the storm, years of work could have vanished overnight. She hurried toward the walls. Then stopped. For a moment she simply stared. The walls were standing. Every single one. The massive retaining structures she had spent years building remained firmly in place. Behind them sat enormous amounts of mud, rock, and debris that otherwise would have crashed directly into her cabin. Martha felt tears fill her eyes. The walls had worked. Everything she had built. Every blister. Every exhausting day. Every painful muscle. Every sacrifice. It had all mattered. A familiar voice called her name. She turned. Ethan was climbing through the snow toward her. The moment he reached the property, he looked at the walls and shook his head in amazement. "Incredible," he said quietly. Martha laughed through her tears. "I can't believe they're still standing." Ethan walked along the stone structure, examining it carefully. The damage was minimal. The walls had absorbed tremendous pressure. They had protected the entire hillside. Finally he stopped and looked directly at her. "You built this." Martha smiled. "We built this." For a second neither moved. Then Ethan reached for her hand. It felt natural. Simple. Neither had planned it. Yet neither wanted to let go. As winter continued, news of the walls spread throughout the valley. People came to see them. Farmers inspected the construction. Neighbors who once doubted Martha now praised her determination. Some even asked for advice on protecting their own properties. For the first time in many years, Martha found herself at the center of something positive. Not because of her appearance. Not because of gossip. But because of her accomplishments. The recognition felt good. Yet what mattered most wasn't the admiration. It was the person standing beside her. As months passed, Ethan became part of her everyday life. He repaired a damaged shed. She helped him organize supplies in his cabin. They shared meals. Celebrated holidays. Spent evenings talking by the fireplace. Neither noticed exactly when friendship became something deeper. Perhaps there was no single moment. Perhaps love arrived quietly. Like sunrise over the mountains. One evening in early spring, the snow finally began melting. The setting sun painted the peaks with shades of gold and orange. Martha and Ethan stood beside the longest wall on the property. Together they had recently expanded it farther along the hillside. The structure stretched across the landscape like a permanent part of the mountain itself. Ethan rested his hand on the stone. "It'll probably outlast both of us." Martha laughed. "That's the idea." For several moments they admired the view. The valley below was coming back to life. New grass appeared through the melting snow. Birds returned to the forests. Streams flowed freely once again. Everything seemed full of possibility. Finally Ethan spoke. "When I first saw these walls, I thought they were impressive." Martha smiled. "Only impressive?" His eyes softened. "I was wrong." She looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Ethan took a slow breath. For years he had carried loneliness like a heavy pack on his shoulders. For years he had convinced himself that the best part of his life was behind him. Then he met Martha. A woman who refused to surrender. A woman who kept building even when nobody believed in her. A woman whose strength came not from perfection but from perseverance. "I thought these walls were made of stone," he said quietly. Martha's smile widened. "And now?" Ethan gently squeezed her hand. "Now I think they're made of hope." The words hung in the evening air. Simple. Honest. True. Tears filled Martha's eyes. Not because she was sad. Because she understood exactly what he meant. The walls had never been only about protection. They represented survival.